Most people believe identity is something they possess. A name, a history, a collection of preferences, loyalties, wounds, ambitions. Something solid, something earned, something sacred. But if that were true, it would not collapse so easily. Watch a man lose status and observe how his voice changes. Watch affection disappear from his life and see how quickly his personality rearranges itself. Remove applause, remove comfort, remove the eyes that once approved of him, and something disturbing begins to emerge. Not strength, not authenticity, panic. Because beneath what he calls identity is often nothing more than negotiation. This is the quiet truth few people dare to examine. The self most defend is not born from certainty, but from adaptation. It is assembled slowly, almost invisibly, through reward and punishment. Approval becomes architecture. Rejection becomes law. What appears to be individuality is often survival wearing ceremonial clothing. And survival is rarely honest. A child learns this long before language can explain it. Certain emotions receive warmth. Others receive distance. Certain behaviors attract protection. Others create tension. The lesson arrives silently, become acceptable, or become alone. So the construction begins. Not deliberately, not maliciously, simply efficiently. The child becomes readable, predictable, safe for others. Years pass and the disguise grows roots. People call this maturity. Nietzsche saw something darker. He understood that much of human life is spent preserving structures we never consciously chose. Not because they are true, but because they are familiar. Familiar suffering feels safer than unfamiliar freedom. The known prison becomes preferable to the uncertain wilderness beyond it. And so people spend decades protecting an identity that was designed during moments of dependence. Look carefully at the people around you. Notice how fiercely they defend opinions they never investigated. Notice how moral certainty often appears strongest in those most terrified of ambiguity. Notice how identity becomes less a discovery and more a fortress. Because once a person fuses their existence with an image of themselves, questioning that image feels like death. And in a way, it is. This is why transformation is rare. People admire change in language, but fear it in reality. They celebrate reinvention until it threatens the arrangement. That makes them comfortable. A man says he wants freedom, yet repeats the same rituals of thought that keep him imprisoned. A woman says she desires truth, yet protects the illusions that preserve emotional security. Entire lives become performances repeated so often they no longer feel performed. The tragedy is not deception. The tragedy is identification with deception. Most do not know they are acting. Nietzsche understood that the greatest barriers are not external authorities, but internal inheritances. Ideas absorbed so early they feel self-generated. Values accepted so completely they become invisible. Patterns mistaken for destiny. People imagine domination as something imposed from outside. They rarely recognize its quieter form. The domination of inherited identity. A prison with no visible walls. This is why people react strangely when confronted with uncomfortable truths. The resistance is rarely intellectual. It is biological. Threaten belief, and you threaten belonging. Threaten identity, and the nervous system responds as though survival itself is endangered. What appears irrational is often ancient self-protection. The human creature seeks coherence more desperately than truth. Truth is unpredictable. Coherence provides continuity, and continuity feels safe. This explains a pattern visible almost everywhere. People tolerate misery longer than uncertainty. They remain loyal to relationships that diminish them, institutions that exploit them, and self-images that quietly poison their potential. Not because they enjoy suffering, but because suffering they understand feels less frightening than freedom they do not. The old self survives through repetition, and repetition becomes destiny. There is a hidden economy operating beneath human interaction. Most exchanges are not merely conversations. They are negotiations of identity. Observe carefully. People do not simply speak. They present versions of themselves calibrated for survival. One version for authority, one for intimacy, one for competition, one for strangers. And beneath these performances lies an uncomfortable question few ask sincerely. Which one is real? The answer disturbs people because it threatens simplicity. Perhaps none. Or perhaps reality exists beneath all of them. buried beneath years of strategic adaptation. This is why loneliness unsettles so many. Not because solitude itself is painful, but because silence interrupts performance. When distractions disappear, when social mirrors vanish, a person encounters something difficult to escape. The possibility that the self they have defended so passionately may be incomplete, artificial, or fundamentally borrowed. This encounter is rarely peaceful. People flee from it through noise, through constant stimulation, through endless opinion and manufactured urgency. Because stillness has a dangerous quality. It exposes. And exposure is intolerable to identities dependent on concealment. Nietzsche did not offer comfort here. He offered confrontation. He saw that destruction is often a prerequisite for creation, not destruction of the body, nor reckless rebellion for its own sake, but destruction of illusion. This is where most retreat. They admire the language of transformation while secretly negotiating with preservation. They want improvement without surrender, evolution without sacrifice, power without loss. But the old identity does not dissolve politely. It resists, not because it is evil, but because it was built to protect continuity. Even dysfunctional identities serve a purpose. The anxious self protects against humiliation. The agreeable self protects against rejection. The arrogant self protects against inadequacy. The detached self protects against vulnerability. These identities are not random defects. They are adaptive structures. And that is precisely why abandoning them feels dangerous. People often ask why they repeat destructive patterns despite recognizing them. The answer is uncomfortable, because patterns are not sustained merely by habit. They are sustained by identity. A person will sabotage opportunity before abandoning a self-concept that has become psychologically familiar. They will reject liberation if liberation requires becoming psychologically unrecognizable to themselves. This is why insight alone changes little. Awareness is not transformation. One may understand the cage and still remain inside it. The old self possesses gravity, and gravity does not disappear because one has learned its name. There is another truth beneath this one, perhaps darker. Human beings are rewarded for predictability. Society speaks reverently of individuality, yet often punishes genuine deviation. Not always openly. Sometimes through subtle exclusion, withdrawal of approval, social cooling, unspoken suspicion. Groups depend upon stability, and stability prefers recognizable identities. This creates tension. The individual who begins changing too deeply threatens the expectations surrounding them. People say they want honesty from others. Often they want consistency. Consistency is easier to manage. Predictable people are easier to classify, easier to trust, easier to control. And here another uncomfortable pattern emerges. Many relationships are not built upon understanding, but upon mutual role maintenance. One plays the rescuer. Another plays the dependent. One performs strength. Another performs admiration. One carries authority. Another carries obedience. The arrangement stabilizes itself, not necessarily through malice, simply through emotional economy. When one person changes, the balance destabilizes. This is why transformation often provokes resistance from those closest to us. Not always because they hate growth, but because change threatens established emotional agreements. The old identity was convenient, familiar, useful, and usefulness is often mistaken for love. There are moments when a person begins sensing this, usually not during triumph, during fracture, failure, humiliation, loss, moments when the carefully arranged narrative develops cracks. These experiences are hated precisely because they expose dependency on illusion. A career collapses and the individual discovers how much self-worth was outsourced to status. A relationship ends and buried emptiness becomes visible. Public admiration fades and confidence evaporates with alarming speed. At first, these events feel cruel. Later, some recognize them differently, as revelation. Because the collapse did not create emptiness, it exposed what was already there. This is the threshold Nietzsche pointed toward. Not inspiration, not self-help, something colder. The realization that transformation is not self-improvement. It is self-erasure before reconstruction. And most people do not fear becoming worse. They fear becoming unknown. The old identity understands its territory. Even its pain feels intimate. The unknown self offers no such certainty. No guarantees. No applause. only confrontation. And this is where the deeper struggle begins. Not against society, not against enemies, but against the internal authority that whispers with familiar certainty. Remain who you have always been. Preserve what others recognize. Protect the mask. Because the mask, after enough years, no longer feels like disguise. It feels like skin. And what people call personal growth is often merely decorating that skin more elegantly. True transformation begins somewhere far less comfortable. It begins when a person suspects that the face they protect so desperately may never have been entirely theirs to begin with. There is a moment in certain lives that arrives without ceremony. No thunder, no revelation worthy of poetry, only disturbance, a growing suspicion that the person staring back from the mirror is not false enough to be called a lie, yet not true enough to feel alive. This is where most retreat, not because they lack intelligence, but because the mind protects continuity more fiercely than truth. The familiar self may be restrictive, humiliating, even quietly destructive, yet it remains known territory. And the human creature, despite its claims of courage, often values orientation over freedom. The old identity survives through attachment. Attachment to reputation, attachment to history, attachment to the stories repeated so often they become indistinguishable from memory itself. Ask a man who he is, and he rarely describes present reality. He presents an archive, occupation, loyalty, wounds, achievements, betrayals, roles, accumulated over years like ceremonial armor. But armor has an inconvenient nature. It protects, and it imprisons. This is why Nietzsche spoke with such cold suspicion toward inherited identity. He recognized that many people do not possess convictions. They possess inheritances disguised as convictions. Their values are not examined, but absorbed. Their morality is often less a product of reflection than social conditioning, reinforced through reward and fear. This realization disturbs people because it feels accusatory. It is not. It is observational. Human beings are imitative long before they are independent. They borrow language, posture, emotional reactions, ambitions. Even desire is often borrowed. People imagine their wants emerge from some sacred inner source. Yet observe carefully. Many chase admiration they never questioned, status they do not genuinely enjoy, relationships that mirror social expectation rather than personal truth. Entire lives become negotiations with invisible audiences. And audiences are dangerous things, because the gaze of others has extraordinary power over identity. A person watched too closely eventually begins performing even in solitude. This is not weakness. It is conditioning. The need for social survival trains people to anticipate judgment before it arrives. They learn to edit themselves instinctively. Certain thoughts remain unspoken. Certain impulses are hidden. Certain aspects of personality are slowly abandoned. Not because they are harmful, but because they are inconvenient to collective approval. And so a strange inversion occurs. The individual begins managing appearances with greater care than reality itself. Image becomes sovereign. This creates a quiet vulnerability. The person dependent on image becomes governable, not necessarily through force, through perception, because whoever controls reputation often controls behavior. This is one of the oldest dynamics of power. Open domination is inefficient. More subtle influence works through psychological dependency. The fear of exclusion, the fear of humiliation, the fear of social death. These fears shape conduct more effectively than direct coercion ever could. People like to imagine themselves immune to influence. Yet watch how quickly confidence rearranges itself under approval or criticism. Observe how many opinions shift when social pressure changes direction. The desire to belong hides beneath sophisticated language, yet its presence remains unmistakable. This is why manipulation rarely begins with deception. It begins with recognition. The skilled observer studies need. Need for validation. Need for certainty. Need for identity. Where need exists, leverage follows. The insecure seek reassurance. The ambitious seek recognition. The lonely seek attachment. And wherever survival appears emotionally dependent upon external approval, control becomes possible, not always through cruelty, sometimes through affection. This is what people misunderstand about power. They imagine it as aggression. Often it is dependence arranged asymmetrically. The person needing less usually possesses greater freedom. This principle operates quietly across human interaction. In friendships, romance, institutions, families, one person fears loss more intensely than the other. One protects the connection at greater personal cost. One becomes increasingly flexible while the other remains stable. The imbalance may remain unspoken. Its effects do not. This is why transformation threatens established relationships. When identity changes, dependency patterns change with it. The agreeable person becomes difficult to manipulate. The fearful person becomes unpredictable. The chronically accommodating individual begins refusing expectations, once accepted without resistance. And those accustomed to the previous arrangement rarely welcome this calmly. People often mistake resistance for concern. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is something colder. The discomfort that emerges when another person becomes harder to manage. This does not make others villains. Most control is unconscious. Human beings prefer relational stability. They seek predictability because predictability reduces uncertainty. If someone has occupied a particular role for years, the caretaker, the pleaser, the dependable one, their transformation unsettles surrounding expectations. The system resists, not through conspiracy, through habit, and habit possesses remarkable force. This explains why the death of identity feels socially dangerous. Because identities do not exist in isolation. They become contracts, unspoken agreements. You remain who I understand you to be, and I will respond accordingly. Break the agreement, and confusion emerges. Sometimes resentment, sometimes withdrawal. The individual entering transformation often interprets this as betrayal. It is more complicated than that. People mourn predictability, even when predictability harms them. This creates a difficult truth. Transformation is rarely accompanied by universal support. The world celebrates reinvention abstractly, yet distrusts it intimately. Because genuine change disrupts psychological economies built over years. And disruption creates friction. Many abandon transformation at this stage. Not because the old self feels meaningful, because exile feels expensive. The need to remain recognizable pulls them backward. So they compromise. They redesign appearance while preserving psychology. New language, same fear. New philosophy, same dependency. New confidence, same hunger for permission. This is not transformation. It is renovation. The architecture remains untouched. Nietzsche demanded something harsher. Not performance. Transvaluation. The interrogation of values themselves. A brutal question asked without sentiment. Who benefits from the self you have become? The answer is often uncomfortable. Perhaps authority benefited. Perhaps family. Perhaps institutions. Perhaps fear itself. This question is dangerous because it destabilizes innocence. The old identity rarely survives scrutiny without resistance. It defends itself through rationalization. People say, this is simply who I am. But identity frequently disguises adaptation as essence. The anxious say they are cautious. The controlling say they are responsible. The submissive say they are peaceful. The emotionally unavailable say they are independent. Language softens confrontation. It protects continuity. And continuity is seductive. Because dismantling identity creates emptiness before it creates freedom. This is the stage people misunderstand most. They imagine transformation as empowerment. At first, it feels more like disorientation. The old self weakens. The new self has not yet formed. And between them exists psychological wilderness. No stable narrative. No reassuring certainty. Only absence. This absence frightens people because they mistake it for failure. But emptiness has a function. It reveals what was previously buried beneath performance. Many encounter loneliness here. Not merely social loneliness. Existential loneliness. The realization that certain relationships depended more upon compliance than mutual understanding. That admiration sometimes required self-betrayal. That belonging occasionally demanded fragmentation. These discoveries are not dramatic. They are quiet. And quiet realizations often alter lives more profoundly than emotional spectacles. This is where some become bitter. They conclude that all affection is manipulation, all morality hypocrisy, all loyalty illusion. This is another trap. Disillusionment mistaken for wisdom. Nietzsche did not advocate cynicism. He distrusted comforting illusions. But he also distrusted despair masquerading as insight. The purpose of destroying false identity is not emptiness. It is sovereignty, not domination over others. dominion over dependency, the ability to stand without psychological servitude to approval. This is rarer than people imagine, because freedom sounds attractive until it removes excuses. The old identity provides shelter. One can blame upbringing, circumstance, expectations, history. But once illusion begins collapsing, responsibility becomes difficult to evade. And responsibility carries weight. No inherited script. No social costume to hide behind. Only choice. This is why so many cling to former versions of themselves long after those identities have become unbearable. The known self may be painful, but it absolves uncertainty. The unknown self offers possibility and accountability. And accountability feels heavier than suffering. So the old identity bargains. Remain familiar. Remain acceptable. Remain legible. Do not become too difficult to classify. But classification has a price. People categorized too completely eventually become predictable to others and invisible to themselves. They know how to behave. They no longer know how to be. And perhaps this is the quiet tragedy beneath modern existence. Not that people are oppressed by visible chains, but that many preserve internal prisons with remarkable devotion. They defend limitations inherited from fear, call them personality, and spend years negotiating with walls they could have questioned. The death of the old identity is therefore not heroic. It is unsettling, sometimes lonely, often misunderstood. It strips away performances mistaken for essence and reveals something people spend entire lives avoiding. That much of what they protected was constructed for survival, not truth. And this realization carries no comfort. Because once a person sees the architecture of their own mask, innocence becomes impossible. The old self begins to feel less like home and more like evidence. And that is the final discomfort. The greatest prison was never built by enemies. It was assembled patiently from adaptation, fear, approval, and memory, then defended as though it were the soul itself. Most people never escape it, not because the door is locked, because they mistake the cage for their face.